Good day, everyone. Today we are now focusing on the next part of Freud's psychoanalytic theory, which is now focused on the personality components. Now, before I will talk about the different components, I'll just like to go ahead and try to recall on the activity that you did on activity number one. So in this activity, I asked you to recall an event wherein it could either be in a meeting if you are working already, or when you are in your class, which that class period is before lunchtime and you were very hungry already because you did not take your breakfast and snack prior to that. I asked you to narrate the situation and asked what decision did you take and the factors that were involved and how you arrive at your decision. Now, if you would look into all these questions that I ask, these questions are anchored on the personality components of Freud, the id, the ego, and the superego. Now, let's try to get to know all these three components. So you can see there an interaction between a person in a person's mind. You can recall, as you can see here, the id wants that he needs to eat right at the second. However, the superego tells him that you can do that because you're in the middle of an important meeting, and the ego is left deciding what would the ego choose, the id or the superego. Now, to know more about these three components, let's proceed. So, what is id? Now, according to Freud, the id is the source of all psychic energy, making it the primary component of personality. Well, as you can see, id is present the moment that you are born. This aspect of personality is entirely unconscious and includes instinctive and primitive behaviors. So, in your activity there, in activity number one, if you can recall, what that you were so hungry, what is telling you to eat because you're already very hungry is the id. Now, why does Freud say that it is present when you are during birth? Because the id helps the baby to survive. Why? Because the baby do not know how to talk. The baby do not know how to express himself or herself through the language, verbal language that the adults are doing. So the id tells the baby to cry until the needs is satisfied. So in that case, the baby would not um, stop crying unless the baby is given what he or she wants. For example, a food or in the form of a milk. So that's the id. The id operates on the take take note pleasure principle. Okay, the id operates in the pleasure principle. So let's go ahead on the next component, which is the ego. So, and this component, according to Freud, it develops from the id and ensures that the impulses of the id can be expressed in a manner acceptable acceptable in the real world. So it is the component of personality that is responsible for dealing with reality. So if you can remember in activity number one, since you were very hungry, what did you do? Did you go outside right away in your classroom or from a meeting just for you to eat the lunch that since you are so hungry, or you did wait before the meeting ends? So what did you do? So that the ego tells you that, hey, id, you cannot eat right now because that's not the acceptable manner in the real world. You have to eat after the meeting. So the ego, on the other hand, operates on the reality principle. Okay, so take into comparison id, pleasure principle, ego, reality principle. So since the ego tells the id nga, you cannot eat right now because that's not the acceptable manner in the real world. So the ego would um, tell the id to wait. Okay, by delaying the gratification, the ego does not necessarily tell the id nga, no, you cannot do that. However, the ego would want the id to do it in a way that it is acceptable. It is in a manner which is operating in the real world. Okay, that's the ego. On the other hand, the third component of personality that a person or a child develops is the superego. Freud believed that superego begins and emerges at around age 5, and the superego holds the internalized moral standards and ideals that we acquire from our parents and our society. So basically here, the superego operates on conscience. Okay, in pleasure principle, ego reality principle, superego is um conscience, operates on the conscience because it is our sense of right and wrong. So in the meeting or in the classroom, the superego would tell the id na, no, you should not go out, okay? Because it's not right, okay? So that is the work of superego, the part of our mind that says that we should not do it because it is not good. Okay, that's the superego. So if you would like to ask her, how can we define, how can we look at the components? Are they separate? Basically, these three components interact with one another. They are not separate entities that can be separated in and are compartmentalized. So, for example, on that situation when you were in the classroom, um, the id wants to eat. The superego doesn't allow the id to eat. However, the ego makes a balance. The ego wants to satisfy the id without making the superego feel guilty. So that's the reason why he would tell to both that, hey, we can have a win-win situation here. So if um you can have your pleasure, you can eat after we are done with our class or with our meeting. And superego, yeah, we will not go out in the classroom or in the meeting unless it's done. So in that sense, both of the components that are actually balanced. So the ego wanted to balance both of these two. Okay, so those are the interaction between the id, the ego, and the superego. Now, a question here, what happens if there is an imbalance? So since they operate with uh, one another, so here the ego is able to adequately moderate between the demands of the reality, the id, and the superego. A healthy and well-adjusted personality emerges. So if there's an adequate balance, Freud believed that an imbalance between these elements would lead to a maladaptive personality. So what does it mean? So for example, if there is too much id, meaning you want your pleasure to be satisfied right away, a person could develop a very impulsive behavior that what he wants, he would get and he would want to get it right away. Well, on the other hand, if there is too much of the superego, a person could develop this judgmental behavior, meaning since you are too righteous, you know what is good and what is not good. People who are doing it not in the right way, you will already judge them by their actions because you are thinking of yourself as too righteous. That it makes you a judgmental person. Then that is too much superego. Okay, so that happens when there is an imbalance. So basically, it is the job of the ego to create a balance between the two components. So that's it for everyone. Our personality components, the id, the ego, and the superego. Thank you for listening, and that's for our lesson today on the personality components of Freud.